You've probably had this exact urge before. To disappear completely, delete the group chats, go quiet, and rebuild your entire life somewhere nobody's watching. That pull isn't cowardice, and it isn't just about hiding. By the end of this video, you'll understand the real psychological reasons some people choose to change in private, and why an unfinished identity may need evidence before it needs an audience. Picture the night you've probably lived yourself in one form or another. You're lying in bed, and out of nowhere, a wave of motivation hits you. Tomorrow, everything changes. You're going to get in shape, or finally start that business, or fix whatever has been broken for months. You map it out in your head, half asleep and completely convinced. And then you make the move that quietly undoes the whole thing. You tell someone. A text to a friend, a vague post, a comment at dinner. They respond exactly the way you hoped. Proud of you, excited for you, already telling you how much this is going to change your life. For a few seconds, it feels incredible, like you have already done it. Then 1 week becomes three. And when someone finally asks how it is going, you feel that specific kind of shame that comes from having to explain why nothing actually happened. This is not because you are lazy, and it is not some unique personal failure. Psychologists have studied what can happen when another person acknowledges the identity you are planning to become. When someone else takes notice of the identity you are reaching for, the disciplined person, the entrepreneur, the person who finally got their life together, something strange happens internally. Being recognized for who you are trying to become can start to feel like evidence that you already are that person. Not because you did the work, but because someone else treated the idea as real. The mind does not always distinguish cleanly between being seen as someone and becoming them. So the moment of being congratulated can quietly function like a small premature finish line. And once some part of you has crossed a finish line, however small, the pressure that was driving you forward starts to fade. None of this means silence is automatically the better strategy, or that you should never tell anyone what you are working on. Other research complicates the picture. People who share a goal with the right person in the right way often end up with more real support and more follow through, not less. The distinction that matters is not secrecy versus openness. It is indiscriminate disclosure versus selective useful support. Telling everyone who will listen is not the same thing as telling the one or two people who will actually hold you to it. What determines which one you are doing usually comes down to a single question. Are you looking for someone to witness a plan or someone to help you actually build it? Because a new identity may need evidence before it needs witnesses. But a stalled plan is the easy version. The harder version begins after a failure other people already know about. A breakup everyone watched unravel. A business that quietly folded after you told half your contact list about it. A job you built your whole identity around. Gone. And here's the part that surprises people. The loss itself is rarely the hardest thing to carry. The hardest thing is rebuilding while an audience still remembers the fall. The people checking in mean well. How are you holding up? Have you figured things out yet? Usually, they are asking because they care. But after a while, those questions can stop feeling like care. They start feeling like a spotlight pointed directly at the part of your life that is still unfinished. There's a real reason for that. Researchers have spent decades studying what produces the strongest stress responses in people, and one pattern appears again and again. Difficulty alone is not the biggest trigger. Stress rises sharply when two things happen together. Your performance can be judged by someone else, and you do not fully control whether you will succeed. Social evaluation plus uncertainty is an unusually powerful combination. Rebuilding your life is almost a perfect match for both conditions. You don't know yet if the new habit will stick, if the business will work, if you'll actually become the version of yourself you're aiming for. And if people are watching that uncertainty in real time, every step stops being a private experiment and starts becoming a public performance. You're no longer just trying something, failing, adjusting, and trying again. You're auditioning for a verdict, and that changes behavior. Once rebuilding becomes something other people can judge, you start optimizing not only for progress, but for how progress looks. The ugly experiments become harder to tolerate. The awkward first attempts feel riskier. You become more tempted to choose the move that looks competent instead of the move that teaches you something. But rebuilding almost always requires looking incompetent for a while. You try a routine that fails, you choose the wrong strategy, you change your mind. You discover that the version of yourself you thought you wanted to become does not actually fit. Real change needs room for those corrections, and an audience can make every correction feel like evidence against you. That's the actual cost of rebuilding in public. It is not simply embarrassment, it is that the social stakes can become so high that experimentation turns into performance. So when the instinct to disappear kicks in after a fall, it isn't necessarily collapse. Sometimes it is a response to a very specific problem. You can't experiment freely while you feel like you're being graded. There is a reason the image of a wounded animal retreating somewhere quiet feels so intuitive. It does not stay exposed while it recovers. It reduces the number of threats around it until it can function again. For a person rebuilding a life, privacy can serve a similar psychological purpose. You're not disappearing, so you never have to face the world again. You're lowering the stakes long enough to become someone capable of facing it differently. So, say you actually do it. You pull back from the audience, you stop narrating your progress, and you start doing the quiet, repetitive work. What you run into next isn't triumph, it's a strange, uncomfortable middle where neither version of you feels true. You've stopped drinking, but you don't feel like a sober person yet. You just feel like someone white knuckling their way through Friday nights. You've been running for 6 weeks, but you still hesitate before calling yourself a runner. Like the word belongs to someone more legitimate than you. You've left the relationship, cut the contact, done the work, but you don't feel like the healed version of yourself yet either. You're just someone standing in the gap between who you were and who you're trying to become. And neither one currently fits. This isn't a flaw in the process. Psychologists who study how people imagine their future selves have found that we all carry around mental pictures of who we might become. The version of us we're hoping for, and sometimes the version we're afraid of. These imagined selves are made of the same material as real identity: goals, hopes, fears, expectations. But they don't feel real the way your current self feels real because they haven't been lived in yet. They're closer to a plan than a memory. That gap is exactly where it gets uncomfortable. The old identity is familiar but no longer wanted. The new one is wanted but not yet familiar. And most people expect this transition to feel like relief. Like the moment you decide to change should also be the moment you start feeling different. It almost never works that way. The decision can happen in a single night. Identity doesn't move that fast, it has to catch up through repetition. And this reveals one of the strangest parts of rebuilding in secret. Privacy can make rebuilding easier socially and harder psychologically. When you tell everyone, they hand you little pieces of the identity before you've earned them. They start calling you the guy who's getting healthy, the one who's finally serious about the business, and some part of you gets to borrow that identity secondhand. When you do it alone, nobody lends you the label. You only get to earn it one unwitnessed rep at a time. It is slower, it is lonelier. But every piece of that identity is now backed by evidence you created yourself. None of this is a breakdown, and it isn't some dramatic unraveling of the self. It's closer to being in transit. You've left one place and you haven't arrived at the next one yet. The discomfort isn't a sign that something has gone wrong. It's what it feels like when your behavior has started changing before your identity has caught up. This gap is also exactly where most people go back. Not because they're weak, and not because they didn't want it badly enough. They go back because two very ordinary psychological forces are both pulling in the same direction, and almost nobody notices either one happening. The first is your environment. Habits don't live in your willpower nearly as much as people assume, they live in your surroundings. The same bar stool, the same drive home, past the same fast food sign, the same time of night when your phone used to come out. Researchers who study habit formation have found that behavior gets quietly stitched to the specific contexts it happened in, so strongly that the context alone can trigger the old response before you've consciously decided anything. You don't relapse because you chose to. You relapse because your environment asked a question your body already knew the answer to. The second force is the people who already know you. This one is less obvious and much harder to forgive yourself for falling into. People form a stable picture of who you are, and relationships quietly organize themselves around that picture. When you start changing, you're not only changing yourself, you're changing the role everyone else learned how to play around you. So the old friend jokes about your old habits like they're still current. Family brings up the version of you they're used to managing. Someone hands you the exact thing you're trying to walk away from just this once. And it doesn't feel like sabotage, it feels like being known. And that's what makes the pull so difficult to notice. Returning to the old version of yourself can briefly feel less like regression and more like belonging. Put those two forces together: an environment still filled with your old cues, and relationships still rehearsing your old role. And the pull backward starts to make a lot more sense than the story where you simply didn't want it enough. This is the real case for doing some of the rebuilding in private, not mystery, not performance, not some cinematic disappearing act. Distance from the coups and distance from the relationships that keep rehearsing who you used to be gives new behavior room to repeat without constantly competing against the old version. You're not hiding from accountability. You're creating enough distance from the old pattern for the new one to stop feeling like an exception. It would be easy to walk away from everything so far and land on a simple, wrong conclusion: cut everyone off, go dark, trust nobody until you're done. That's essentially where a lot of disappear and rebuild advice ends up, and it's worth stopping here to say clearly that's not what any of this actually points to. Needing less audience is not the same thing as needing zero support. Decades of research on stress and social support point to something more specific. Connection can be valuable on its own, but when someone is under real stress, the support that protects them most is often the support that actually answers the problem in front of them. Useful information when they don't know what to do. Practical help when the load is too heavy. Emotional steadiness when everything feels unstable. That distinction matters here. Someone knowing what you're doing is not automatically support. Someone helping you do it is. And this brings us back to something from earlier. Sharing a goal can help when telling someone brings useful support into the process. It can also backfire when being recognized for the person you're planning to become starts substituting for the work of becoming them. From the outside, those two situations look almost identical. In both cases, you told someone. But one gives you a witness, the other gives you an ally. So, the actual skill being described in this video was never total secrecy. It's closer to a filter. You're not deciding between everyone knows and no one knows. You're deciding who gets access to the parts of you that are still unfinished, and who only gets access once there's something real behind them. Privacy controls access, isolation removes support. Those are not the same thing. Cutting off everyone who could genuinely help you in the name of privacy isn't discipline. It's isolation wearing a more respectable name. The people worth keeping close during a rebuild are the ones whose presence makes the work easier rather than making you more conscious of how the work looks. They don't need constant updates. They don't turn every setback into a conversation about whether you're succeeding. They give you something useful: perspective, knowledge, stability, accountability, practical help, and then they let you keep building. There may only be a few people in your life who can do that. Those are not the people you disappear from. If you've spent any time online, you've seen the aesthetic version of this: the 4 a.m. wake up, black coffee, a stoic quote over a slow motion gym clip. It looks disciplined, cinematic, almost enviable. And it's worth saying plainly that is not what rebuilding your life in secret actually looks like. That's just a performance with a smaller audience. If you're arranging your rebuild to look like a rebuild, you're still spending energy on how transformation appears instead of whether it's actually happening. What it actually looks like is duller than anyone wants to admit. It's moving a small, unremarkable amount of money into savings before you can talk yourself out of it. It's practicing a skill badly, alone, for weeks, with nothing to show anyone yet. It's not replying to the message from the person you're trying to stop needing. It's showing up to the same unglamorous task at the same time, on the days you would get away with skipping it and nobody would ever know. It's the 40th rep of something that still doesn't feel like part of who you are. There's no clean finish line for any of these, and no honest version of the process comes with a fixed number attached to it. People who study how long it actually takes for a new behavior to become automatic have found the answer varies enormously. Weeks for some habits, the better part of a year for others, depending on the person and what's being built. If it's taking you longer than you expected, that's not evidence you're doing it wrong. It's just what the process looks like once you stop measuring it against a movie montage. And somewhere in the middle of all that unglamorous repetition, the original fuel is often still there. The private urge to prove something to the people who doubted you. That's a perfectly normal place to start. It's just not where this process tends to leave you. And that desire to prove something can carry you surprisingly far. But something strange tends to happen by the time the rebuild is actually finished. Each unwitnessed rep, the money saved with no one watching, the skill practiced badly and then less badly, the message you didn't send, the routine you kept on the days it would have been easy to skip, is doing more than moving you toward a goal, is giving you evidence, not praise, not reassurance, not somebody telling you that you're capable. Evidence. Psychologists who study confidence have consistently found that actually succeeding at something yourself is one of the strongest foundations for believing you can do it again. Being told you're capable can help, but doing it becomes harder evidence than being told you can. And once enough of that evidence exists, the question underneath the whole rebuild begins to change. Early on, you were asking, what will they think when they see me? Later, the question becomes, do I believe myself now? That's a very different foundation to live on. Your judgment of yourself is no longer resting as heavily on whether other people notice, approve, or change their opinion of you. It starts resting on things you can verify directly: whether you did the work, whether you kept the promise, whether you can trust yourself to repeat what you said you would repeat. And when your own evidence becomes strong enough, other people's reactions lose some of the authority they used to have. Not because you stopped caring about people, because their verdict is no longer the thing making your new identity real. That's the paradox nobody plans for. You start the process needing them to see it. If it actually works, you finish it no longer needing them to. Eventually, the rebuild does become visible again. Not because you announce it, because it's hard to hide a life that's actually working. Someone notices you're calmer. Someone asks what changed. Someone finally sees the thing you spent months building without them. And here's what's strange. By the time that happens, the reveal barely matters anymore. You don't need the moment you used to picture their faces, their surprise, the vindication of it. You already know what you built. You watched yourself build it. That's the real difference between hiding and rebuilding in secret. Hiding is organized around avoiding being seen. Rebuilding in secret is about giving something unfinished enough room to become real before the world gets a vote. The secrecy was never really about them. It was about protecting the unfinished part of you until you had enough evidence to stop needing an audience to tell you whether it was real. So if you're in that stretch right now, quiet, unfinished, not explaining yourself to everyone, that's not necessarily you falling behind. That might be exactly what building something real looks like from the outside.